Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Salvadoran Civil War, one of the most devastating and violent conflicts in modern Latin American history.
Alright, first, to understand why the Salvadorian Civil War happened, you have to first understand the terrible conditions in El Salvador before the fighting even started. One of the biggest problems was extreme economic inequality. So basically, a tiny group of landowners, wealthy landowners, controlled most of the country's land, businesses, and wealth, while majority of the Salvadorians lived in poverty. The economy depended on coffee exports, which made the wealthy plantation owners even richer. Meanwhile, poor farmers and laborers worked long hours for low pay and struggled to afford food, health care, education, or clean water. Many families didn't own land at all and depended on a seasonal agricultural work just to survive. The wealthy elite also had a major influence over government and military. Because of this, many Salvadorians believed the political system only protected rich landowners and ignored ordinary citizens. Whenever reforms were proposed, wealthy elites often blocked them because they feared losing power or money. People began organizing protests, labor unions, church groups, and peasant movements demanding fair wages, land redistribution, and political reform. But instead of listening, the government continued to increase violence against these peaceful protesters, causing a great political repression throughout the country.
With that, the 1977 election came. And in 1977, General Carlos Romero came to power through a fraudulent election. With the election, there were a ton of protesters who would be met with military violence and who would ultimately be open fired on, and they were just unarmed civilians. Many of these protesters were either killed or injured, which increased anger or hatred toward the government and really caused political repression. Jake, do you know anything about that?
There's a lot of repression in El Salvador, and a big reason for that was death squads. The Salvadorian government would respond to any opposition with military force, and they would use death squads, which were used to silence critics, activists, teachers, priests, and students. Between 1980 and 1981, the army used assassinations, bombings, arrests, and torture. And around 85% of human rights violations were later blamed on the government or state military. The government believed that harsh violence was necessary to stop communist influence. And an example of this is Oscar Romero, where he was born on August 15th, 1917, who quickly became archbishop and was a voice for poor and oppressed Salvadorians. And he criticized violence, and he spoke out against the government. And then one of his close friends was murdered for helping peasants organize just the revolution. And then Romero began openly speaking against military and death squads. And on March 24th, 1980, he was assassinated while celebrating mass, and that created kind of a big uprising within El Salvador, and is a major reason why the FMLN was created.
Gotcha. And going back to 1979, where the military coup happened. So in October 1979, Carlos Romero was removed from power in El Salvador by a military coup. This event marked the end of almost 50 years of direct military rule in the country, and the coup allowed a period of significant political upheaval, leading to the outbreak of the Civil War that lasted around 12 years. The coup also signals a shift where the United States increased its involvement in El Salvador's affairs, which escalated political violence and reforms that also led to the assassination of Oscar Romero, like Jake just explained. So this was one of the main key events that led to Oscar Romero's assassination. And yeah, so Liam, I know there's another guy, Dr. Arce. What do you know about him?
Yeah, Dr. Arce was another victim of the death squads that Jake was talking about earlier. However, he didn't actually die from these death squads. But to start off, a little background about him. He was Dr. Romogazar Arce was born in Yucatan in El Salvador. As a young man, he studied medicine at the University of El Salvador and originally planned to become a heart surgeon. Instead of focusing on only wealthy patients, he actually helps like the poor people who couldn't afford health care at the time. However, the government thought that because he was helping the poor people, he was going against them, and so they shot him, kidnapped him, and imprisoned him for about 3 weeks. During that time, he was tortured. The torture severely damaged his hands, which meant he could no longer continue the surgical career he had worked so hard for. And then in 1981, he actually escaped and fled to Mexico, where a few years later, in 1983, he moved to the United States, where he received political asylum and eventually became a U.S. citizen. But even after everything he experienced, he still dedicated his life to helping others. And in Washington, D.C., he became the director of La Clínica de Pueblo, which is a clinic that focuses on helping low-income families, immigrants, and Central American refugees who often struggle to get medical care. And then he also became an important player in human rights history when he went to the courts and he fought in a case called Arce versus Garcia, which he basically sued all the Salvadorian military leaders who were responsible for the torture and human rights abuses that they committed during the war.
Eventually, people got tired of the constant oppression and decided they had enough. And this is where the Farbundo Martí National Liberation Front was created, also known as the FMLN, officially formed in 1980, and this is the real starting point of the war. So the FMLN consisted of 5 major left-wing guerrilla organizations who used guerrilla warfare, which is ambushes, mountain fighting, and close-range combat, along with attacks from forests and rural areas. Supported by peasants, workers, students, and reform groups. Many members believe peaceful protest was no longer able after Romero's assassination. So the goals of the FMLN were political reform, less inequality, end military repression, and more democratic elections.
Yeah, so FMLN actually had a big part in the El Mazate massacre, which was part of the war. To start with some background and context about El Mazate, the El Mazate massacre happened in December 1981 during the Salvadorian Civil War, which was a conflict between the government and left-wing rebel groups. It took place in the rural village of El Mazate in northeastern El Salvador, and the attack was carried out by the Atlicatao Battalion, which is an elite unit of the Salvadorian army that had been trained and supported by the United States during the Cold War. And then on December 10th, 1981, soldiers went into the area looking for fighters from the FMLN, a left-wing guerrilla group fighting against the government, like Jake said. And the army believed villagers were helping or connected to the FMLN, so even without solid evidence, they treated the whole area as if it was supporting the rebels. And then moving on to the real massacre. People were forced out of their homes and gathered together, and then they would be separated and held overnight. And on December 11th, 1981, soldiers started killing villagers. Men, women, and children were all targeted, even though they were unarmed civilians. A lot of the victims were young kids, with nearly half estimated to be under 10 years old. There were 978 people killed, with 553 of those people being children. Entire families were wiped out, making it one of the worst attacks on civilians in Latin America history. Afterwards, soldiers burned buildings and tried to destroy evidence of what happened. And that leads to the denial and investigation. At first, both the U.S. and El Salvador were denying that the massacre had even taken place. And there were not many survivors left to tell the story. So journalists and survivors tried to tell what really happened, but they had to do such things as line barbed wire connecting phones between each other to stay under disguise. So in 1981, the clandestine guerrilla began, and their 2 main broadcasters, Santiago and Mariposa, came out and became the voices of the revolution. They would transmit news from the front lines and reported military abuses that no other stations covered. The station's politics and popularity made them a high-profile target, and because they operated in a relatively small area, its broadcasters had to move constantly to avoid being captured. Liam, what else do you know about that?
Communicate the undetected, the groups, they modified 2 radios into telephones linked together through kilometers of barbed wire. This way the government couldn't track their conversations, and this secret telephone line helped them stay one step ahead of their pursuers. In October of 1984, the government soldiers actually finally captured them after the years of evading, and Monterosa himself went to retrieve the equipment and help a theatrical press conference. But the transmitter was booby-trapped, and once Monterosa's helicopter left the press conference, radio members detonated the device over El Mote, killing the colonel over the village he massacred.
And one really cool fact that I thought about the El Mazate massacre was days before the massacre took place, radio messages and voicemails had been sent to the residents of El Mazate, and that all people in the area would be killed. And according to these messages, the only way that the residents could escape was death. So that's just one interesting fact I thought about El Mazate's massacre. And there's many, like I said earlier, the U.S. involvement So, does anyone know anything more broad about the U.S. involvement?
Yeah, so the U.S. Really became more involved in El Salvador because of the Cold War, and the Reagan administration feared that El Salvador could become like another communist ally like Cuba or Nicaragua. So the U.S. supported the Salvadorian government with military aid, weapons, training, and money. Um, the U.S. believed that the formation of the FMLN has Soviet and Cuban connections, and this is why the United States was so defensive of the Salvadorian government. Even though the Salvadorian military committed major human rights abuses, the U.S. just continued to support them to stop communism, or what they thought was communism. And the FMLN mainly wanted reforms against poverty and inequality. But during the Cold War, the U.S. often viewed leftist reform movements as communist threats. And this kind of leads into the murder of the four American churchwomen who were kidnapped, raped, and murdered in 1980. They were helping poor communists and supporting social justice efforts. But the Salvadorian military members were blamed. The murders caused outrage in the United States, and the U.S. briefly stopped sending aid to El Salvador, but later resumed because the Reagan administration still feared the communist expansion in El Salvador. So the Salvadorian officials tried covering up evidence. U.S. trained soldiers were involved, and two generals later accused of helping cover it up. Jose Guillermo Garcia and Carlos Anguino Casanova, who was actually living in the U.S. at the time that they figured this out. So it was just honestly kind of the whole situation was kind of a mess, and the U.S. didn't really understand what was right.
Yeah, so with that, going to the end of the war officially ended in 1992 with the Chapultepec Accords, and the agreement required the army to shrink, guerrilla groups to disband, and it created a new civilian police force, the PNC, plus the Human Rights Commission, and the FMLN stopped being a rebel group and became a real political party, an electoral group, like we said before. And a UN Truth Commission recorded thousands of war crimes, mostly committed by government forces. And some immediate aftermath from when the war ended was the crime. Crime went way up after the war, mostly because there was a ton of weapons still around, and the government didn't follow through on promises like land and financial help for former fighters, which led to violent protests in January 1995. And death squads kept carrying out killings and attacks even after the war had ended, and there were new economic policies and weak government systems, which caused a lot of instability and insecurity. So, like I said, there was a lot of crime, and there was gangs, a ton of them, and there's main gangs called like the MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang, and they became a huge part of everyday life. The murder rate spiked and became one of the highest in the world, and El Salvador is mainly known for their gangs and the crime. And because of that, a lot of people kept leaving the country because of poverty, violence, and instability. And by 2014, tens of thousands of kids were fleeing alone to the U.S. border. So they would just leave their parents just because of the crime, and it got so bad. So, yeah,
Really quickly, just before we wrap things up, Jake, earlier you mentioned Cuba and the communist ties and how that feared the U.S. So I'm going to just go over a few similarities and differences between the two wars. To start off, both conflicts were actually caused by economic inequality and poverty. In both countries, the wealth was and land were controlled by the small, wealthy elite groups, and a lot of people struggled to survive. Both involved oppositions to the government seen as corrupt or oppressive. People believed the governments mainly protected the rich and the powerful throughout both of these wars, and that upset the rest of the countries. The Cold War tensions influenced both conflicts because the United States feared the spread of communism in Latin America and became heavily involved in the region. However, these turned out differently because some of the differences is in Cuba, the USR actually influenced Cuba more than the United States did. That became a communist country, while in El Salvador they stayed true to the United States. And then another difference was the Cuban Revolution was mainly a revolution to overthrow one dictator, Batista, while the El Salvadorian Civil War was just a long civil war between the government and guerrilla groups, the FMLN.
Overall, the Civil War was really deadly, and around 75,000 people died during the war. Tens of thousands of people disappeared or were displaced. And later, a Truth Commission investigated human rights abuses. The commission found that state/military were responsible for most of the violations, and the war left long-term trauma and political division in El Salvador.
So overall, through our podcast, we went over the conditions before the Civil War, the 1977 election, political repression, the military coup, Dr. Arce, Oscar Romero, Carlos Romero, El Mazate massacre, the U.S.'s involvement, Ronald Reagan, and the end of the war, how it ended, and gang rises like the MS-13 and Bukele's gang. So, and we also compared and contrasted the Cuban Revolution to this El Salvador Civil War.